welcome to my interpretive talk on the Canadian Rockies. The official title is the Canadian Rockies in 1 hour, because originally it was a 1-hour slideshow that I put together for Parks Canada way back in 1983 when I was a seasonal naturalist in Jasper National Park. There were about a dozen of us park interpreters on staff, and we each had to put together a slideshow that would entertain 400 people at Whistler's Campground Theatre, which was the biggest outdoor theater in the park, for an hour. So I got a whole bunch of slides on animals and birds and such, and then added some of my own to put together something that I thought would entertain them for an hour. And it must have worked, because you can always tell when you've done a show that people liked. They would come up afterwards to ask you questions about it and so on. So this was pretty popular. After all the natural history stuff, I got over with that, in the first half hour or so. Then I moved on to stuff that was more interesting and exciting. A climb of Mount Robson that I had done, and icefield skiing. Skiing across the Wapta icefield in winter, which is pretty exciting. And then I finished up with something really cool. It was a trip to the back of Castleguard Cave, which is a place that hardly anyone goes ever. But there was a big expedition there in 1982, and I got in on it and was able to take pictures. So I finish up with this at the back of Castleguard Cave, 5 miles underground, way out underneath the Columbia icefield, in a limestone cave, in the rock underneath. Finish with that, and it always got big applause, and people would come up and ask me questions. So anyway, enjoy my favorite and probably very best slideshow, the Canadian Rockies in 1 hour, which kept growing until it's now really the Canadian Rockies in 2 hours.
Ah, the Canadian Rockies, eh? This is the view from Moraine Lake in the Valley of the Ten Peaks near Lake Louise. It's world famous. It's been on the back of the Canadian $20 bill. So let's just put it right on the flag. I have been lucky enough to spend most of my life in or near the Rockies, at times hiking through scenery such as this, Castleguard Meadows in northern Banff National Park. Near the end of the talk, I'm going to show you what lies beneath those meadows. You will also see what it's like to be up on the heights, climbing the peaks, including this one, Mount Robson. It's the highest summit in the Canadian Rockies. Over the course of the talk, I'm going to take you on that climb. But it will be a while before we get there. First, I'm going to show you a lot of boring geography and natural history slides. I know how it is. The lights go down, the presenter drones on, and pretty soon it's well nigh impossible to stay awake. So feel free. But please be advised that after the dull, pedantic part of my show comes the exciting adventure part. You're not going to want to miss that. So it would be wise to appoint a designated non-sleeper in your row to stay awake and notify the rest of you when the time comes. Okay, while you're doing that, I'll begin with the basics. Where exactly are the Canadian Rockies, so gorgeous and so impressive? Well, in Canada, of course. I have labeled this map with the names of some U.S. states and Canadian provinces. Any Canadians in the audience tonight can probably tell you what all those postal abbreviations mean, including the U.S. ones. But if you're from the States, which I'll bet many of you are, can you do that with the Canadian ones too? I see a few people shaking their heads. Okay, YT is for Yukon Territory, official name for what we call the Yukon, even though we're all supposed to say just Yukon, no the, but everyone ignores that. NT is for Northwest Territories. Most people add the, and so does the NT government. The Northwest Territories once extended all the way east to Hudson Bay, but in 1999, the federal government cut the Northwest Territories in half. The eastern part was named Nunavut, total population about 40,000, mostly Inuit. Nunavut is frequently mispronounced Nunavut. With that in mind, my wife says that they should have renamed the remaining half of the Northwest Territories the rest of it. Here's the geographic footprint of the Canadian Rockies. Please note that the range extends about 90 kilometers south into the U.S. Not officially, of course, because they are the Canadian Rockies, but physiographically, geologically, and biologically, Glacier National Park, Montana is part of the Canadian-style Rockies. The international border really should have a bump southward to reflect this, don't you think? I have suggested it to the U.S. government, but they have rejected the idea. This is even after sweetening the pot by offering to trade for one of our own beauty spots. Say, Sudbury, Ontario. Only kidding. Please note also that the Canadian Rockies do not extend into the Yukon. The mountains definitely do, and they are very much like the Rockies, but officially they are the Mackenzie Mountains. Plus, way up north we have the Arctic Mountains, which are an eastern extension of Alaska's Brooks Range. The northern end of the Rockies, period, is the Liard River. By chance it flows along the boundary between the Yukon and British Columbia. I have shown the pertinent section of Liard River in blue. The western boundary of the Rockies is the Rocky Mountain Trench. This is a very long valley that divides the Rockies from the Columbia Mountains. Farther north, the Rocky Mountain Trench separates the Rockies from the Omineca Mountains and the Cassiar Mountains, which for some reason I have failed to include on this map. Sorry about that. I am now too old and tired to do it. Besides, most Canadians have never heard of the Ominecas and the Cassiars. Hardly anyone lives there. Good. Farther west in British Columbia lie the Coast Mountains. The Coast Mountains are higher, more rugged, and even more beautiful than the Rockies. But tonight's topic is the Rockies, so we are going to ignore the Coast Mountains, except to say that from the Rockies to the Coast Mountains, and including the mountains of Vancouver Island, we can apply the term Canadian Cordillera. This term is handy for two reasons. First, it covers all the mountains of Western Canada. And second, it has given British geographers a chance to do what the British do best, which is to mispronounce languages other than English. Cordillera is Spanish, and beautifully so. Cordillera. Having taken a course in Spanish, I know how to pronounce Cordillera, and I know what it means, a mountainous region. But show the printed word Cordillera to any British geographer, and by extension most Canadian geographers who slavishly follow British usage, and you will hear Cordillera. Ugh. From today forward, let's get this right. Follow me, please. Cordillera. 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 Thank you. Your geographical education is now well ahead of most everyone in the British Commonwealth. Back to ignoring mountain ranges. We're also going to ignore the north end of the Cascades, that long line of famous volcanoes along the west coast of the U.S. Volcanoes are not allowed in the Canadian Rockies, except for just one we know of. It's in southeastern British Columbia near Crow's Nest Pass. It erupted 90 million years ago, more than enough time for it to have eroded away, leaving only the roots and some of the stuff that came out of it. However, there is a mountain in the Crow's Nest Pass area that does look rather like a volcano. This one. It's called Crow's Nest Mountain. Easy to see why so many people assume it's a volcano, eh? But it's not. As you will find on this page from one of my books, Crow's Nest Mountain is made of limestone and shale. To the best of my knowledge, limestone and shale do not come out of volcanoes. However, many local residents are certain that geology is all nonsense, and they know a volcano when they see one. The Canadian Rockies are made mostly of sedimentary rock. The layering is beautifully displayed in Castle Mountain along the Trans-Canada Highway between Banff and Lake Louise. The rock below the tree line is mostly quartzite, which is hardened up sandstone. A close-up view of that quartzite shows the individual grains of sand in it, plus some excellent cross-bedding in which layers meet each other at an angle. Oh, this is the sort of photo that can make geologists swoon just looking at it. Above the tree line in Castle Mountain, the rock is mostly limestone, or a similar rock called dolostone. Here's a close-up view of a limestone layer. It contains a fossil snail. The snail has a wonderful scientific name, Euophthalus, which means true belly button in Latin. I nominate this for the silliest scientific name ever invented. You may be wondering how old that rock is. Okay, I'm going to let you in on a secret that all geologists have been sworn not to divulge. The secret is how they determine the age of rocks. We are all friends here, so I'm going to tell you. You read the date on the penny. Well, this is a Devonian penny, about 370 million years old. Not many of these are still in circulation. Back to that picture of Castle Mountain. This is the west end. It's the east end that you see in most photos of this famous peak. But the west end better illustrates something else that geologists would rather you not know, which is this. Every bit of sediment in that mountain originated in the sea, and every bit of that sediment has been through the gut of one sea creature or another before it became rock. So what you are looking at really is half a kilometer of accumulated fish poop. Now, having dealt with what the rock is made of, now we can deal with how the mountains were made. It's all about plate tectonics. Classic textbook plate tectonics. About 185 million years ago, the western edge of North America collided with a bunch of islands riding along on a different plate of the Earth's crust. My apologies to any of you who are creationists and aren't believing a word of what I said. Feel free to ignore the next couple of slides. But for those of you who are into science, and I certainly am, here's the skinny on how the Canadian Rockies came to be. Basically, a lot of sedimentary rock got pushed hard and far. The upper panel of the diagram shows this rock as it was originally deposited. The lower panel of the diagram shows what happened to it when British Columbia joined the Canadian Confederation back in the Jurassic. By British Columbia, I'm referring to the purplish stuff with the arrow. Much of the province is a collection of terrains, meaning land masses that started in one place on the planet and wound up somewhere else. In this case, the terrains got squashed together in the plate collision. Acting like a monumental bulldozer, they kept moving, scraping a thickness of 20 kilometers of sedimentary rock off the North American plate and piling it up northeastward. Please note that this is up-piling, not uplift. The Canadian Rockies were not pushed up from below, growing higher and higher. No, the motion was essentially horizontal, as the arrow indicates. If anything, the weight of the growing pile on North America actually pushed the plate down into the mantle a little. Overall, two things happened. One, the piling up occurred faster than erosion could wear it down. And erosion began the minute the mountain stuck up above sea level, of course. This is an important concept. If erosion was faster than mountain building, we wouldn't have any mountains here, right? But we do. So mountain building triumphed over erosion. And two, despite ongoing erosion with little or no further mountain building, the pile has remained sufficiently high to maintain a spectacular mountain range. I mean, look at this. During the orogeny, which is the technical term for an episode of mountain building, some of the Rockies wrinkled up into huge folds, such as this one in Mount Kidd, west of Calgary. You can see it along Highway 40 in Kananaskis country. To give you an idea of the scale of that fold, two folds really, an anticline on the left linking to a syncline on the right, To give you an idea of the scale, those itty-bitty green things are trees. And that little white rectangle near the bottom of the photo, that's a frozen waterfall about 100 meters high. The layers seen here are part of Opal Peak, also in Kananaskis country. They started out flat, then they got bent nearly straight upward during the orogeny. Wow! At present, the fastest eroders of the Canadian Rockies are glaciers. Well, aside from rock slides, which are practically instantaneous, but they don't happen very often. Glacial erosion at high altitudes in the Rockies is continuous and has been going on for at least the past few million years. This is a view of the Columbia ice field, which is a very large glacier. We are seeing only a part of it here. As of 2007, which was the most recent year in which the Columbia ice field was photographed accurately from the air and measured, it was 215 square kilometers in size. The ice field has lost some area since then, owing to global warming, but it's still the largest glacier in the Rocky Mountains of Canada or the U.S. However, the Columbia ice field is nowhere near as big as some of the glaciers in the coast mountains of British Columbia and the Alaska Panhandle. The Juneau ice field, for example, lies in an equivalent latitude and has an area of about 3,900 square kilometers. The Columbia ice field is less than a tenth of that. Still, take it from me, a person who has walked all the way across the ice field to climb that mountain in the background, it's pretty big. That's Mount Columbia in the distance. Mount Columbia is the highest point on the ice field. It's also the highest point in Alberta and the second highest summit in the Canadian Rockies after Mount Robson, of which we will hear more later in the show. Glaciers move. They grind away at the rock they are sliding over. In this way, the ice field is doing its very best to reduce the height of Mount Columbia. Given the current erosion rate in the Canadian Rockies, which averages about 1 millimeter per year, the summit of Mount Columbia will lie at the elevation of downtown Calgary in only 27 million years. Go and climb it while you may. But enough geology and geography. This slideshow is really about the seasons as we see them in the Canadian Rockies. It's about spring, summer, fall, and winter. Those photos were taken near Jasper. I had to stand in that spot for a very long time to get them. I hope you appreciate that. Let's start with that tried and true, if hackneyed, approach to the seasons, signs of spring. I should be showing you pictures of early blooming wildflowers, right? Nope. Around here, the first sign of spring is this little guy. Gal. It's a female Dermacenter andersoni, the Rocky Mountain wood tick, and she's hunting around on someone's skin for the perfect spot at which to suck out as much blood as possible. Guy ticks do not do this. Guy ticks are searching for beer. Seldom finding any, they settle for second best, that is, mating with a female. Then they die. In the process of trying to empty a host of its fluid content, and aren't you glad these things are small? A female tick also gives something back. Arthropod saliva, i.e. tick spit. Tick spit can contain pathogens, including the microbe that causes Rocky Mountain spotted fever. You don't want to get Rocky Mountain spotted fever. At the very least, it will wreck your whole summer, and at the worst, it may kill you. So if you've been out hiking in the Canadian Rockies in April or May, when female ticks are doing their thing, at the end of the day, have a tick pick. Do this with a friend to check your back. Hairy places are popular tick turf, as are tight spots under your clothing, for example, under bra straps and the elastic band on your underwear. Fortunately, as Dermacenter andersoni explores your body, she acts like any other tourist driving around the campground looking for the best site. Then she takes a while preparing dinner, meaning that she inserts her mouth parts slowly, so you typically have a few hours in which to find her and remove her before she actually starts to feed. Alas, once you find her, you have to terminate her with extreme prejudice. Flushing her down the toilet is a good choice. If you just chuck her out the door, you will find her to be very loyal. She will come back to you. And don't squash her between your fingers. These things do not squash easily, and if they do, you will be smearing yourself with whatever contagion resides within. Time for some myth-busting about ticks. Ticks do not drop from trees as you pass by. This myth comes from finding a tick, or maybe 10 of them, in your hair. But no, they have climbed up there once they get onto your body from lower down. They actually lie in wait on the seed heads of grasses, as you see here. They hang out there, literally hang out there, the front 4 of their 8 legs extended imploringly toward any passerby. Deer, elk, moose, and bighorn sheep are preferred, but humans will do. And here's another myth to bust about our ticks. They do not dig themselves into your body. Only the small mouth parts penetrate the skin. But they embed those mouth parts so well that ripping a tick off your body is a bad idea. The mouth parts, laced as they are with possibly pathogenic tick spit, will remain stuck in your skin. So you have to encourage the tick to detach on its own. Forget using alcohol or the end of a lit cigarette. This will only kill the tick while it is still attached. A gentle but persistent tug is the key. For this, you can buy a wee little lever that works very well. I keep one in my first aid kit and have had to use it several times, mostly on people I have encountered along the trail screaming, "Eek, Ernie, get it off me!" Enough about ticks? Good. Let's move on. Here is the classic spring bird of the Canadian Rockies, the ruffed grouse. This one is a male trying to attract a female. It does this by strutting about, spreading its tail, fluffing out the feathers on its neck, and calling thump, 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 the tempo increasing toward the end. This sound carries a long way, so the trick is to distinguish the mating call of a ruffed grouse from the sound of a big diesel engine starting up somewhere in the woods. Like the males of most any species carried away with sexual fervor, these birds can be aggressive. Their claws are sharp, so if you encounter one along the trail, it's wise to give it plenty of room. Seeing one always reminds me of Sid Marty's wonderful account of a bird he named Tex, guard grouse of the Porcupine Hills. Sid Marty is a famous Canadian author. In one of his books, he recounts how Tex intimidated a motorcycle gang. They fled with Tex hanging onto a helmet, hammering away like a woodpecker. Marty ended the story by lamenting Tex's death. As happens so often to wild things, it was caused by an automobile. Recovering the lifeless form, he said, "We looked for his brain, but alas, we could not find it." And finally, here's your obligatory spring wildflower, Pulsatilla patens. Well, you could say patens or patens, as you please. I'm giving you the scientific name, not the common name, prairie crocus, which is wrong on 2 counts. Count 1, this flower is just as common in low-elevation meadows in the mountains as it is out on the prairies. Count 2, it's not a crocus at all. It's in the buttercup family. So here's a name I like better than prairie crocus. I like pasque flower. It refers to how early it blooms in the spring, often around Easter. Pulsatilla patens was first classified many years ago as a member of the Pulsatilla genus. Then it was reclassified as a member of the anemone genus, which is the name I learned, Anemone patens. Now it's back to being a pulsatilla. Fine with me. Like the mispronunciation of Canadian Cordillera earlier in the show. We should say Canadian Cordillera, of course. Well, anemone was also always getting mispronounced. anemone. Same with sea anemones being called sea anemones, or even worse, sea anemones. Here is a good way to remember how to say anemone. Think of it as any money, but with the accent on the second syllable, and you'll get it right. There's no hope for Cordillera, and we do have plants in the Rockies that remain members of the anemone genus, so no hope for them either. But Pulsatilla patens, at least, need not be insulted by semi-literate naturalist wannabes. By the time June rolls in, we Canadian Rockies residents are more than ready for warm summer days. But alas, June is the rainy month in our area, and the rain comes down cold. Still, park visitors are starting to roll into the campgrounds. They pop up their tents in the freezing drizzle and crawl into their sleeping bags, hoping for a better day tomorrow. Instead, they get this. These two guys told me they were heading back to L.A. But eventually, we reach July. The weather improves. Schools are out in Canada, and apparently everywhere else in the world, because scads of tourists arrive. Here's a busload of them at the Peyto Lake viewpoint in Banff National Park. By the way, that should be Peyto Lake. It was Bill Peyto, not Bill Peyto. But even I can't get that right all the time. But anyway, those folks are very impressed with the scenery, except for the person who stared at me while I took this photo. Of course, what they are really hoping to see is wildlife. Of this, we have plenty, and right along the highway, too. When you see this sign, "Caution, sheep on road," we really mean it. Here are a bunch of female bighorn sheep just getting off the bus, ready to start the day's work. They are all employed by the Jasper Chamber of Commerce to attract tourists. Okay, here's what they really do. They lick salt off a highway. They are not afraid of people, and they don't mind getting their pictures taken. You can get amazing photos right out your car window, like this bighorn ram. Full curl on the horns, scars on the nose from the fights he's been in with other rams during the mating season. Wouldn't you just love to get a picture like that? So I stuck my camera out the window of the car. Here's the photo I got. The sheep was wiggling its nose at me. It was hoping for a handout, but I didn't give it one, and neither should you. No. It's against park regulations to feed him anything. Keep your potato chips inside the car. And with good reason. Not only is junk food bad for them, it keeps them out on the highway hoping for salty snacks. And they get hit by cars, especially by big trucks, many of which barrel through the slowdown zones Parks Canada has put in place along stretches where they know the sheep hang out. Smacking a bighorn would mess up the front of your car, but it won't do much to the massive bumper of an 18-wheeler. Even if the truckers observe the 70 km/h speed limit in what the park wardens call the kill zones, well, that's still too fast. I remember when this speed limit was first introduced in the 1990s. It was 60 km/h, down from the standard 90 km/h throughout the park, which is down from 100 or 110 on most Alberta highways. That didn't last long. The trucking lobby got it raised from 60 to 70 km/h in a matter of weeks. Sure, we can blame the trucking companies for putting a tiny little delay in getting through the park ahead of wildlife protection. But Parks Canada is equally guilty. Those bighorns would not be standing in the middle of the road were it not for the rock salt the agency spreads on the highways all winter as de-icer. Some salt remains there in summer. Bighorn sheep crave salt, and they are not smart about oncoming vehicles. They just stand there, licking the road surface, and they get hit. There are alternative de-icing compounds available, and I have urged Parks Canada to use them, but they don't. Too expensive, they say. But what is one of those full curl rams worth as a tourist draw? And why should protecting this iconic wildlife species be a matter of money anyway? And not much money at that. Parks Canada and I have our differences. These are mountain goats. People are always confusing bighorn sheep and mountain goats, but they look quite different. Bighorn sheep, mountain goat. As you can see here, mountain goats are white all over with skinny black horns, and they aren't really goats. True goats are all in the genus Capra. The scientific name for the mountain goat is Oreamnos americanus. Oreamnos means mountain lamb. Wrong again, cause a lamb is a baby sheep. A baby mountain goat is called a kid, just like the offspring of real goats. Even though, as I just said, they aren't real goats. In fact, there are no other Oreamnos species in the world. This is the only one. Its closest relatives are goat antelopes in Asia. The ancestors of Oreamnos must have come from there during the ice ages when sea level was lower and animals could move into North America over the Bering Land Bridge. Evolution in isolation did the rest. You might think that these animals would be just as attracted to road salt as bighorns are, but not so. This picture was taken near Disaster Point along Highway 16 east of Jasper in a spot that's popular with both bighorn sheep and mountain goats. Yet the goats seldom lick the highway like the sheep do. Instead, this goat is having a sip of water after licking the black shale you see behind it. Well, what's in the shale? Iron pyrite, which contains sulfur. It's the sulfur the goats are after. They need it for growing their thick coats. And just so as you know, bighorn sheep are actually sheep. Speaking of animals that got here from Asia, here is another one, the red deer. I know you are thinking that I have it wrong. It's an elk. But listen up. It's actually the word elk that is wrong. The term comes from Northern Europe, and it refers to the moose. A long time ago, some visiting biologist from Germany got off the boat in North America and made a serious wildlife identification error. We have been stuck with it ever since. Even red deer is a bit off. That name refers to the European and Asian species, which are not quite the same as ours. The best name to use is wapiti, which is the official name in Canada. It comes from the Shawnee and Cree indigenous languages, and it means the thing with the white rear end. Perfect. The town of Red Deer, Alberta is named for this animal, as is Wapiti Campground in Jasper National Park, where quite a few wapiti do in fact share the place with human campers. Heck, wapiti come right into my yard in Jasper all winter. They like to eat the grass in the lawn. So I don't give it a last cutting at the end of summer. After all, until humans showed up 10,000 years ago, the place belonged to the wildlife. But when it comes to calling this species wapiti versus elk, I give up. Even the park wardens say elk. You may also hear male wapiti referred to as bulls. Again, even the park wardens use this term, but it is also wrong. As you can see, the correct term is stag. Females are properly termed hinds, not cows. In this case, the British have this right. When Sir Francis Drake sailed around the world on behalf of England, pirating Spanish galleons and pillaging their colonies, he did so in a ship he named the Golden Hind, not the Golden Cow Elk. One last true fact. Red deer, wapiti, had to be reintroduced in the Canadian Rockies in 1920. Railway workers ate the original ones. Well, there were some left in the Rockies north of the Peace River, but hardly anyone knew they were there. nor were there any railroads being built that far north in those days. Good. Okay, here is an elk. It really is. This name, pronounced variously elk or elk or alg in Europe, is correct. But in North America, we call it a moose. Our name comes from the Algonquin indigenous languages of eastern Canada, and it means twig eater. Indeed, this great big animal eats the ends of twigs all winter. It's a living. No naming problem here. These are clearly deer, white-tailed deer. You can tell by the tail, which is mostly brown. Well, okay, it's white underneath, and you see that as the deer runs away from you, tail held high to make sure that you identify it correctly. Here is our other species of deer, the mule deer. It's named for those big ears. The tail is mostly white. You know, it's stuff like this that kept me from majoring in biology at university. I chose geology. Animals and birds and wildflowers are all well and good, but rocks are best. They are always in season, and they never fly away before you can identify them. I'm not sure what this was, but I didn't pick it up. Of all the animals that try to attract your attention, this is my favorite. I know, it looks like a chipmunk, but it's not. Chipmunks have stripes on their faces as well as on their backs. This particular rodent, they're all rodents, it has a white ring around its eye. Just confirming the caption on this photo, I agree that it is, in fact, a golden-mantled ground squirrel. It was probably photographed along one of the highway viewpoints in Jasper National Park. And it's eating a crouton. Croutons are seldom found growing wild in the park. Almost certainly someone has given one to this animal. But who would give a crouton to a ground? But who would give a crouton to a ground squirrel? Not you, I hope. Not in the national park. Please be warned. If a warden catches you so much as swatting a mosquito on your arm, you could get 2 tickets for that. One for feeding wildlife and the other for killing it. Okay, what is this animal? Is it a marmot? No. By now you know that all these are trick questions. It's a Colombian ground squirrel. But does it live in the equatorial country of Colombia? Of course not. It lives in British Columbia and in Alberta and in the Pacific Northwest generally, home of the vast Columbia River drainage basin from which comes the name. Still, just for fun, I once told an audience that the Columbian ground squirrel was, in fact, from Colombia. I told them that the well-known mammalogists Agnes and Gerald Pleby captured a pair of these things near Bogota Still, just for fun, I once told an audience that the Columbian ground squirrel was, in fact, from Colombia. I told them that the well-known mammalogists Agnes and Gerald Pleby captured a pair of these things near Bogota in 1952 and released them on the lawn in front of the Jasper Information Center later that year. The rest is history. When I told this story, no one batted an eye. This time it really is a marmot, a hoary marmot, to use the full name. Hoary because the silvery fur on these animals looks frosty. Marmots live in the park's alpine country, the land above the tree line. They have an enviable life up there, lolling about in flowery meadows all summer. Then they sleep the winter away. If you're a marmot, the only downside is that you may be ripped apart and eaten by a wolverine, or by an eagle, or by a grizzly bear, or by one of these. Well, what is it? You have your choice of fox, coyote, or wolf. Okay, it's probably not a fox because we don't have many foxes in the Canadian Rockies. Well, that leaves us with coyote or wolf. Given the large number of PhD level biologists who are no doubt in the audience today, let's put it to a vote. How many vote for coyote? I'm counting the hands here. Let's see. Oh, okay. And how many vote for wolf? I'm counting the hands again. Somebody voted twice. Stop that. Right. Since most of you voted for coyote, that's what it must be. This is how they used to do science in the Soviet Union. And just in case somebody here is actually wondering, it really is a coyote. Here for comparison is a wolf. The official full name is gray wolf. And in Canada, it's also officially G-R-E-Y, not G-R-A-Y. G-R-E-Y is the British spelling, and we use it because in some ways we're still British here. This is not something I would say while giving this talk in Quebec, where the gray wolf is loup gris. Back to the photo. Does this look like the Malamute you keep seeing loose in your neighborhood? Now you know what that animal really is. And by the way, in the Canadian Rockies, you can't identify a wolf by its coloration. True to its species name, we have gray ones like this, but we also have all over black ones and all over white ones, brown ones too, and combinations. What is a wildlife watcher to do? Well, here are two surefire ways to identify a true wolf. Ready for this? First, look at the eyes. They are always yellow. Then check the tail. It may be carried pointing up, or it may be level with the wolf's back, or pointing downward like this one, but it will always be straight. If the wolf-like creature attacking you in our area has its tail curved over its back, it's not a wolf, it's a dog. In fact, it's always going to be a dog. We needn't be afraid of wolves here. I have shared the forests around Jasper with plenty of them. Since records have been kept, there have been only 4 documented attacks by wild wolves in Canada. However, one of these was fatal. In 2005, 22-year-old Kenton Carnegie was killed by a pack of wolves near his geological field camp in northern Saskatchewan. The wolves had been habituated to garbage improperly dumped around the camp. Most of the other known wolf attacks have also involved food. Captive wolves, the ones you see behind the fence in a, quote, wildlife park, unquote, are known to be dangerous. Stay clear. Enough about canids, wild and otherwise. Ever see tracks like these in the mud after a rainy night in your area? You might, if bears live there. But they probably won't be the tracks of this particular species. The grizzly bear. Just hearing the words grizzly bear may get the hairs on the back of your neck standing up. But I must tell you that this animal's fearsome reputation is undeserved. It is, after all, the same species as the brown bear of Europe, which was employed for many years in circuses, wearing funny hats and riding around the ring on a tricycle. I mean, look at those cute ears. Look at that fuzzy face. Look at those long claws. Truly, though, in the Canadian Rockies, the grizzly bear is a shy guy of the high country. It spends its summers in alpine meadows, where it eats mostly vegetation. In the winter, it sleeps under the snow way up there. Attacks on humans are quite rare, so I'm not at all afraid of it. That canister of pepper spray I always carry on my waist while I'm hiking in grizzly country, you didn't see that. Here's the bear that is way more likely to kill and eat you. It's a black bear. They live almost anywhere in North America's woodlands. Black bears are found in New Jersey. Thus, we have become casual in our dealings with black bears. But this is a mistake. They're actually more predatory on humans than grizzly bears are. Give these animals plenty of room. I always do. If you see one of these cute little ones, give it even more room, because guess who might be hanging around just out of sight? It's Mum. So let's just try something else here. How about cats? We haven't covered cats. This is a lynx, our most common wildcat. We have bobcats as well, which are about the same size, but spotted, and cougars, which are much bigger. By the way, about that name, lynx, a friend of mine in Jasper assumed that lynx was the plural term for this species. He always referred to a single one as a link. Lynx are secretive. In all my years in the Canadian Rockies, I have seen only a few. One of them, though, was in plain sight, sitting patiently by a ground squirrel burrow one summer morning. It was waiting for the resident to poke its head out. My wife Sia and I watched from a respectable distance. When the ground squirrel emerged, the lynx caught it in the blink of an eye. Lynx feet are large, partly for walking on snow. The claws are long and, just like those of house cats named Fluffy, quite sharp. As we kept watching the lynx, it looked right at us with the ground squirrel dangling dead from its mouth, as if to say, "This is mine, folks." On to some observations about birds, which I should introduce by telling you what most of you may already know, that these animals are actually dinosaurs. Yes, that's right. Contrary to what we all learned back in elementary school, the dinosaurs did not all die out. Most of them did, of course, when an asteroid hit our planet 66 million years ago. But not all. And here is one of the descendants of the survivors. Clark's nutcracker may not look like T-Rex, but it's worth remembering who its kin were when it's sitting on your hand or stealing bacon from your breakfast. By the way, that photo must have been taken in the backcountry. Look at those fingernails. That's the way they get by about day 5 of a backpacking trip. Clark's nutcracker has a look-alike. Here it is, the Canada Jay. For those of you thinking that I have the name wrong and that it should be Gray Jay, please know that in 2018, the American Ornithological Society changed Gray Jay back to Canada Jay, which was the bird's original name. Well, we in Canada are delighted by that, even though we slavishly use American bird names. More on that in a minute. The Canada Jay is the friendliest bird in the woods. It will also perch on your hand. And like Clark's nutcracker, a gray jay will help itself to whatever you are eating. If you see one gray jay, you will usually see 3. The males and females look alike, and so do the parents and the young as they mature. So what are those 3? Nestlings, most likely. Now nearly grown up, but still hanging out together. Soon they will split up and seek mates of their own. And here it is, the Canada goose, our goodwill ambassador to the United States every winter, where they are mostly unloved. Those droppings on the golf course, you know. But the Americans have their own way of getting even with us. For example, the American Ornithological... For example, the American Ornithological Society has named the robin the American robin. There is the American widgeon and the American redstart, even though all these birds live in Canada in the summer and head south into the U.S. for the winter. But this goose is not named American goose. No, it's Canada goose, suggesting where the Americans wish these birds would stay year-round. In fact, some of them do. In Canada, you can see them paddling around all winter in the outfall from hydro plants and other spots that offer open water. And finally, Here is my favorite dinosaur, the common raven. They are common indeed. You'll see them everywhere in the Canadian Rockies, and at every elevation from downtown Jasper to the summits of the peaks high above. They are terribly smart and very entertaining to watch. They seem to get a kick out of us, too. For example, Sia once saw a pair of ravens following the steps a friend and I had kicked in the snow, sloping up to a cliff we were climbing on. We had been roped together about 10 meters apart as we ascended the snow. The ravens left about the same distance between each other as they hopped from step to step. After they reached the upper end of our line of steps, the ravens said, "Rock!" in a way Sia interpreted as gleeful. Then they flew off. I like ravens. I like them so much that I have written a novel about them. It has won some awards. And 2 members of tonight's audience will also win something tonight, a copy of this book. A skill testing question must be answered. Well, a memory testing question. For those of you who do not win, I have copies of Raven's End available at a very attractive price, plus my other books, and personally inscribed by the author, he said in his warmest, most sincere voice. Gosh, I can see some apparently slumbering members of the audience waking up and starting to pay attention. So here we go. Do we have wildflower aficionados here this evening? Ah, good. And what, pray tell, is the name of this species? Excellent. Wild Gaillardia. Just read out that line there. Excellent. Wild Gaillardia is correct. Please come up after the talk to receive a free copy of Raven's End. Here's another one to know. Any guesses? Calypso orchid, right again. And as before, please come up after the talk to collect your prize. But no prize for this flower. Everyone knows it. All together now, Alberta wild petunia. Okay, it's actually a wild rose. And despite Alberta claiming it is the official floral emblem of the province, to botanists it's the prickly wild rose, Rosa acicularis, not Alberta wild rose. Okay, we have now reached the end of the boring part of my talk. We can now move on to the exciting adventure part. Designated non-sleepers, it is time for you to awaken those around you who have drifted off. Everybody ready? Here comes the fun stuff. It's certainly fun to drive around the Rockies, admiring them from the highway. But if you really want to fully experience these mountains, you need to leave the car behind and get out and walk. Here are some teenagers hiking near Exshaw Pass in the Front Ranges west of Calgary in 1976. They were on the second day of a 10-day adventure with Sia and me. Here was our camp that evening, right at the tree line. What a place to spend the night. Hike any higher than that, and you might wind up on the summit of a mountain, like this guy overlooking Jasper, way down there. You can tell he's a naturalist. He's got a notebook and a beard. If you're a rock climber, like Sia and me, here's a pleasant way to spend an afternoon. Here we are, climbing a 1,000-foot slab in Jasper's Moline Valley. Or you could be way up on Castle Mountain, the peak I showed you earlier. This is what it's like to climb the wall of the castle. A friend of mine and I had just finished a neighboring route on the cliff. We strolled along the flat top of the mountain in time to see our friends doing their last pitch. I know, I'll bet these photos seem scary to those of you who haven't done any rock climbing. But see that rope? It makes all the difference. Without it, you're dead if you fall off. With it, if you fall, the rope catches you. You're suddenly a bit lower on the cliff, but unharmed and ready to try that hard move again. We each have our own way of expressing the pleasure of reaching the top. Here's my friend Eckhart Grassman doing just that. I once asked Eckhart why he stood on his head on top of every mountain he climbed. He thought for a moment, upside down there, and then he said, in his lovely Swiss-German accent, "Well, someone has to do it." He's also a mathematician, which might be relevant. Once you've enjoyed the top of a peak, you have to go back down, right? This part is usually a knee grinder, especially at my age, but some peaks have these long slopes of rock fragments called scree. Scree is surprisingly soft underfoot. You can run down, taking big leaps. It's a blast. Just don't get going too fast. Scree is sharp stuff. All the climbing I've shown you thus far is on rock, steep rock. But in the Canadian Rockies, we also have steep ice. That's what these people are climbing, glacial ice. How can they ascend that extremely slippery slope? Well, they do it with an ice axe in each hand and spikes called crampons on their boots. Crampon is a French term, but it works in English too because it describes what you get on your lower leg when you're not used to front pointing up a pitch like that. You get a cramp on. Even in summer, the upper parts of the higher peaks in the Canadian Rockies remain snowy. It's another world up there. I have loved it well. Especially this peak, the highest of all. Mount Robson. If you drive 100 kilometers west of Jasper along Highway 16 on a clear summer day, Mount Robson can be seen looking just like this. That's the summit elevation above sea level, 3,954 meters, which for Americans in the audience is 12,972 feet. Either way, it's the highest peak in the Canadian Rockies. That's not as high as summit elevations in the Colorado Rockies. Just west of the city of Colorado Springs, where I grew up, lies Pikes Peak, elevation 4,302 meters, over 300 meters higher than Mount Robson. But the elevation gain, which is to say the vertical distance from base to top, is another matter. The elevation gain of Pikes Peak is 2,470 meters above Colorado Springs, and it's the greatest rise found anywhere in the American Rockies. However, that's 500 meters less than the elevation gain on Mount Robson. The summit of Mount Robson is nearly 3 kilometers above its base. It's the tallest peak, not the highest peak, but by far the tallest peak, found anywhere in the Rockies, Canadian or American. That elevation gain comes all at once, too. Robson is really steep. From the base to the summit, the straight line distance is only 3.6 kilometers. Not so Pikes Peak. It's 15 kilometers from the base to the top instead of 3.6 kilometers, a much longer and gentler slope. Thus, Pikes Peak is not nearly as impressive. There is a road right to the summit. There is a railway up this mountain. It's a cog railway, like they have in Switzerland. Now, in this photo, both the highway and the railway are out of view. But you can imagine what it's like to be up there on a busy day in July. The flat summit is taken up mainly with a parking lot, and it can be full. On such a day in 1966, Sia and I climbed Pikes Peak with two of our friends, Billy Davidson and Jim Kazir. We went up the steepest side of the mountain, the one to the right in the shadow. It's a proper mountaineering ascent, not a hike. As we reached the top and were coiling the ropes, a middle-aged fellow walked over to us. He looked down the cliff, sucked in his breath, and quickly stepped back. Then he saw Sia's braids hanging below the brim of her helmet. His eyes widened. A female climber? For a moment he was at a loss for words. And then he said, in a Texas accent, "Where are y'all climbing to?" Jim Kazir replied, "We're going on up," he said, with a straight face. Remember, we were standing on the summit. "Good, good," the man said, turning and walking back to his car. Well, the air was thin up there. There's no railway, no highway on Mount Robson. There's not even a trail to the top, which is always covered with snow and ice. It's a far more difficult mountain than Pikes Peak. But you can climb it with me right now. Here's the usual route up the east side. I have climbed it from the other side, too, the one you see from the highway. But this is the classic approach, the way a young mountain guide from Austria led 2 members of the Alpine Club of Canada to the top in 1913. That was the first ascent. The guide was Conrad Kane. He's on the left there, with Albert McCarthy and William Foster, just after completing the climb. McCarthy was an American ranching in southeastern BC. He was best known later on for leading the first ascent of Mount Logan, Canada's highest peak. Foster was the BC Deputy Minister of Public Works. Foster was with McCarthy on the ascent of Logan, too. Conrad Kane didn't have those big black dots in the snow to follow way back then, or that circle on the mountain to tell you where to pitch your tent, like we do today. Well, okay, not really. But I have been 5 times on Mount Robson and made the summit twice. That's considered to be a pretty good score. Considering the nature of this climb, it's little wonder that it wasn't done until the 20th century. People look at that photo and they wonder what would happen if one of the climbers slipped off that narrow ridge and started to fall down the side. What would the other climber have to do? I'll jump off the other side, of course. The rope between them would run across the crest and catch them both. No, that's not what we do these days. These days, we have something we can stick into the snow and will hold all 3 of us if we fall off. It's a piece of aluminum the size of a dinner plate. You sit in the snow facing the direction the pull will come from if a fall occurs, and you push the fluke into the snow behind you as deeply as you can. That's what you call it, a snow fluke. It has a short cable attached to it. You clip yourself onto that cable, which makes a precise angle with the fluke. Any force applied to the fluke just pulls it deeper into the snow. I took the previous picture of my 2 friends coming toward me as I took in the rope, safely anchored to a snow fluke. If one of them had fallen off, taken the other one with him, the fluke would have held all 3 of us. Back to our climb. Past the narrow ridge, I am approaching a couple of climbers' tents on the part of Robson called the Dome, elevation about 3,000 meters. It's the usual place to camp when you're following Conrad Kane's route up the peak. When we arrived, the temperature had dropped below freezing, even though it was August the 8th. Our boots crunched in the snow. The other climbers in the tents heard us coming, and as we walked up, out came a mug of hot buttered rum. Such is the camaraderie among mountaineers. Soon we were sitting in their tent with them, discussing the attempt on the summit we were all about to make the next day. Here is what we were planning to climb. That slope of ice on the right, it's about 400 meters high. 400 meters is just a number. To give you an idea of the size of the ice face, I've put a circle around some tents at that same camping spot. When Conrad Kane took his 2 clients up the ice face in 1913, crampons didn't have front points like they do now. You used your ice axe to chop steps in the ice, and you stood on them sideways. It must have taken Kane several hours to hack his way up that slope. The other 2 climbers were roped to him. They had to wait patiently before each step up. Well, nowadays, we just kick our front points into the ice and ascend much more quickly. Here is a set of crampons like the ones I used to climb Robson. You can see the front points sticking out to the right. When you're climbing ice, they make all the difference. But despite the superior gear we have these days, Robson is still a serious climb. I remember looking out the door of our tent as the day ended, wondering what would happen tomorrow, or what might happen tonight if those thunderheads came over here. Way up on the dome, there was no place to hide from the lightning. Luckily, the storms moved on. The next morning dawned clear. The only cloud was the cloud of snow blowing off Robson's summit. We were good to go. My climbing partner that day was Greg Spohr, with whom I enjoyed some memorable ascents in the 1970s. On Robson, we both had cameras. Greg took this photo of me starting up the cane face just as the sun lit it up. Again, we were lucky. Most of the steep ice was covered with snow. Of course, that snow could slide off while we were on it, always a worry. But this late in the summer, an avalanche was unlikely. We kept climbing. The snow wasn't solid enough to hold our boots, so we needed to use the front points of our crampons for grip in the glacial ice under the snow. But the snow did help to support our feet, making the climbing easier than it would have been if the ice had been bare. Which it did become. Never mind, Greg and I were experienced at this sort of thing. We were fit and strong. We kept climbing. And not long after that, we reached the southeast ridge of the peak. The cane face is on the left side of it. The climbing was easier along that ridge, but we had to be careful not to walk out on the cornices you see forming scallops along the edge. Each cornice was nothing but snow that had been built out from the crest by the wind blowing up the slope on the right side. Cornices are quite dangerous, and it's hard to tell when you're walking on one. We stayed well to the right of the ridge crest. An hour later, we could see the summit ahead. Some of the other climbers who had camped with us had started earlier than we did. They had reached the top and were on their way back down the peak. We gave each of them a congratulatory handshake. Then it was our turn to stand on top of the highest mountain in the Canadian Rockies, and as you now know, also by far the tallest. That peak in the background is Whitehorn Mountain, and it's about the same height as the peaks around Lake Louise. It's dwarfed by Mount Robson. Greg took this photo of me on the summit. On my chest, you can see one of the snow flukes we were using. Greg had the other. Below the snow fluke, there's an ice screw hanging from a carabiner. We used ice screws as anchors in the bare part of the ice face. Then I pointed my camera at Greg, and while I was messing with it, the clouds suddenly rolled in. We waited, but they hung around until we had to start down, and I never did get a good photo of Greg on the summit. This one would have to do. He has never forgiven me. Oh well, we got back down safely, and suddenly it was autumn. Soon the needles of the larch trees were turning golden. For Sia and me, autumn is our favorite time of year. We married in the fall of 1965 and honeymooned among the yellow aspen groves. But, as the weeks go by, you wake up one morning and it looks like this. Skill testing question. What do the residents of the Canadian Rockies do in the winter, besides head for Palm Springs? You knew the answer. Let me refine that by telling you that there are two kinds of skiing in these mountains. There's downhill skiing, with expensive lift tickets and hordes of people on the slope. And then there's this kind of skiing, backcountry skiing. No lifts. You have to get up there under your own power, moving one ski forward and then the other, hour after hour. Often you have to make your own trail. But the work is spread among a small group of friends who have joined you on this outing. There are no crowds, no loudspeakers blaring rock music, no hamburger wrappers littering the snow. All you hear is the sound of the wind, the swish of your skis sliding along, the thump of your heart, and the whoosh of clean mountain air pulled deep into your lungs with every breath. Eventually you reach the high point of the day's trip. It might be a pass above the tree line, or better, a summit offering a 360-degree view of smashing Canadian Rockies scenery. You take your skis off and you sit on them in the snow. A pair of ravens show up, hoping to share a bit of whatever you brought to eat. You give them some. And then it's time to tighten your boots, check your avalanche beacon, and push off into the powder. You and your friends have it all to yourselves. And how wonderful it is that so much backcountry skiing in the Canadian Rockies is found in national and provincial parks, safe from being turned into ski areas. Here's my elder son, Will, when he was 8 years old, out for the day with me near Helen Lake in Banff National Park. And a gorgeous day it was, as we followed a summer hiking trail that had become a winter skiing trail. Rather different from the day shown here. In this photo, the skiers are crossing Bow Lake, north of Lake Louise, along the Icefields Parkway. It's noon on New Year's Eve. The sun is always low in the sky that time of year this far north, and that day the temperature was hovering around minus 30 Celsius. But here is what those skiers were headed for, the Wapta Icefield. What a place! This is what it looks like in better weather. The Wapta Icefield is a big glacier, and it lies at a high elevation along the Continental Divide, which is pretty much the definition of an ice field in the Canadian Rockies. That peak in the background is Mount Collin. Redo that sentence. That peak in the background is Mount Collie, summit elevation 3,153 meters. The people in the picture are experienced icefield skiers. One can say that for sure by noting that all four of them are upright. Skiing the crusty, wind-driven snow one finds up there ain't easy. The fact that everyone in the photo has made it down that slope without falling shows that they know what they are doing. Not only do they have the necessary skills, they also have the proper skis, which are lightweight yet very strong. They have warm boots and other gear suitable for the extreme conditions they may encounter out on that glacier far from the nearest shelter. Mostly, though, they have a good leader for their trip. Someone with the skills required to navigate through a crevasse field in a whiteout. Someone with many icefield ski tours to their credit. And they need to treat that person with the proper respect. I'm the guy in the blue jacket. So how do you get to become someone like that exalted icefield skiing leader? It helps to start young. Here's my other son, Toby, already zipping down a trail in the Rockies at age 5. And here's Will again, demonstrating what happens when you get to zipping a little too fast. But my all-time favorite skier falling down pictures are this one and the next. Yes, the skier on the right is about to fall, but see the one on the left? He's got some speed up, the powder is flying, and he's headed straight for what you see in the foreground. A trench in the snow. Running along the bottom of the trench, 2 meters down, is the creek. And it's open, not frozen over. Would you like to see what happened next? He sort of made the jump. This did not faze him. He came up smiling, pulled himself out of the trench, shook the snow off, and continued past me. Clearly, that fellow had the makings of an icefield skier. Let me take you on a typical icefield ski trip. It's called the Wapta Traverse. It takes 4 days, and we are going to spend the whole time in this room. No, not actually. For some of you, this slideshow has already gone on too long. I feel your pain. So let's pick up the pace. For the Wapta Traverse, we are going to begin at Bow Lake near the top of this map. The orange line is our route, and the thin dashed line you see near it is the Continental Divide. We are going to follow the divide across the Wapta and Waputink icefields to Wapta Lake along the Trans-Canada Highway, where the orange line ends. The total distance is 35 kilometers. Lake Louise is to the right, and the very small town of Field, British Columbia, is just off the map to the left. Here's a Google Earth view of the Wapta icefield. We're looking at it from about 10 kilometers up. To get up there, you start at Bow Lake along the Icefields Parkway north of Lake Louise. From there, it takes about 4 hours on skis to reach the icefield. The arrows give the dimensions of this great big glacier. It's 6.5 kilometers wide and 13.5 kilometers long. And here's the area, 36 square kilometers. That's down from about 50 square kilometers in 1973 when I first started skiing there. The Google Earth image you see here is from 2011. Now we're into the 2020s, and glacial melt has become even more rapid. It seems likely that the ice field will have completely melted away by 2060, if not sooner. Ski it while you may. Well, we can all ski it this evening through the magic of photography. As a veteran of dozens of these trips, I'm the heroic icefield ski leader on this one, and also the guy taking the pictures. The date is March of 1994. Chris there is the manager of the Mosquito Creek Youth Hostel along the Icefields Parkway. I had met him a couple of weeks before the trip. Mike, who was sitting on his pack some distance away from Chris, was managing the Rampart Creek Youth Hostel. He heard about us doing the Wapta Traverse and asked whether he could come too. Or maybe it was the other way around with Chris. I can't recall. Now, Joe there is an old friend. I've been cross-country skiing with him a lot. Not on any ice fields, mind you, but he was strong and a quick study. So, applying the ironclad rule, you should never go icefield skiing with people you do not know well, but also applying the rule that the more people along, the better, because you won't have to do as much trail breaking. I took my 21-year friendship with Joe and divided by 3. That's 7 years of friendship each, more than enough. Our goal for the first day is to ski across Bow Lake and into the high country at the far end. We're headed for the Bow Hut, which is the tiny dot visible inside the white circle. We're going to get there by skiing around the left side of the cliff. The Calgary Ski Club built the original Bow Hut back in the 1960s. This is what it looked like in 1973, the first time I used it. The hut was operated by Parks Canada and open to anyone at no charge. It had room for 20 people. All you had to do was call Banff National Park and reserve space. It has since been replaced by this newer version built and operated by the Alpine Club of Canada. It's a little farther up the slope and a lot bigger. And you have to pay. In 1994, the cost was $20 per night. As of 2023, that had gone up to $50 per night. But that's half the price of a hotel room these days. And compared to the old hut, the new one is a palace. Mike is clearly very happy to be there. Here's the view off the back porch of the hut at twilight. That's Bow Lake way down there, frozen and covered with snow. You can just make out the Icefields Parkway. It runs along that white stripe in the center of the image. If this picture looks cold, that's because it was. The temperature outside was dropping through -20°C. Next morning, we're starting day 2 of our 4-day ski tour, and a fine day it is. An hour later, we are up on the ice field itself. Conditions are mild. The temperature is only about -10, and there's not much wind. But the snow shovel on Chris's back tells you what we are prepared for, just in case. Should we find ourselves in the middle of the ice field in the teeth of a blizzard, we can dig in. Besides, it's not how good you are. It's what you've got with you and how good you look. By late afternoon, we have reached Balfour Pass. There's a hut in the pass, and it's our destination for the day. This is an isolated spot. It isn't easy to get there. Yet, like most of the world's difficult places, it is also very beautiful. In the morning, we're off on the third day of our trip. That's Mike in the foreground. The peak in the background has special significance for him. You see, Mike's last name is Balfour. He has no idea whether Mount Balfour was named for some relative of his. It wasn't. After the trip, I looked it up. But as far as Mike was concerned, this was his mountain. By God, he was going to climb it. Today. That was fine with the rest of us. In fact, it was part of the plan. Doing the Wapta Traverse is pretty cool, but climbing Mount Balfour along the way is that much better. We reached a good spot for stashing our skis and overnight gear. Then we got out our ice axes and started kicking steps into the wind-packed snow up the steep slope toward the summit ridge. I know this doesn't look very steep, but take it from me, it was. Yet the slope was unlikely to avalanche. There had been no new snow for at least a week, allowing the accumulation from the last storm to settle and compact itself. The little dots in the center of the picture are the stuff we left behind while we were climbing. We were now well on our way up the peak. The weather is holding, we are feeling fine, and Mike is especially happy because he is about to reach the summit of his mountain, which is why we let him do the last 100 yards on his own. Plus, we weren't too sure about the safety of those cornices on either side of the ridge. But here we are atop Mount Balfour, all four of us. The picture was taken by that famed photographer, Self-Timer. I like the variety of sunglasses among our group. Chris, on the left, is wearing a pair of genuine mountaineer's glasses. Now, these are expensive. Knowing how poorly paid youth hostel managers are, I assumed that he had acquired them as left behind. These are expensive. Knowing how poorly paid youth hostel managers are, I assumed that he had acquired them as left-behinds from some well-to-do guest who was unable to get a room in Banff or Jasper that night. Mike took his sunglasses off for the picture to show that this was really him. He was hoping that the photo would come out okay, so he could send copies around to his friends. It did, and he did. Joe is wearing his 1960 Ray-Bans. They don't make 'em like that anymore. I'm on the end, the most nearsighted of the lot, wearing a nerdy pair of regular glasses. But the lenses have been mirror-coated like Chris's. Very cool. And check out my hat, eh? Again, it's not how good you are. We spent an hour up there, enjoying our remarkable surroundings. Then we started down. You can see the slope we came up, on the left, between the light and the shadow. Well, then it hit me. We were walking right along the Continental Divide. Snowmelt and rainwater draining off to the left go into the Bow River, which flows to the South Saskatchewan, the main Saskatchewan, Lake Winnipeg, and the Nelson River, which empties into Hudson Bay on the Atlantic Ocean. Snowmelt and rainwater draining off to the right go into the Yoho River, then into the Kicking Horse, and finally the Columbia, which flows to the Pacific Ocean. Therefore, it was theoretically possible for us, walking along that ridge, to pollute two oceans with one act. We all had to stop and do it. Delighted with the day and what we had accomplished so far, we put our skis and packs back on. We crossed the Balfour High Col and continued across the Waputehk icefield, the next big glacier south of the Wapta. Ahead of us in this picture is Mount Daly on the left and Mount Niles on the right. Sticking up through the gap between them, we could see some of the peaks between Lake Louise and Field. Also in the gap, hidden in the shadow of Mount Daly, is the place we will stay on the last night of our trip, the Scott Duncan Hut. Late in the afternoon, we arrived there. First thing I did was use that outhouse. As you have no doubt deduced already, the essential part of the outhouse is the little brown building, but there is no hole beneath it. Impossible to dig one. At this location, it's all bedrock. And here in Yoho National Park, you can't just let sewage run out all over the place. So under the outhouse, there's a 40-gallon drum. In fact, there are several 40-gallon drums. The extras sit in that extension of the outhouse behind it. The drums are mounted on wheels. When one of the drums fills up, you put a lid on it, push it out of the way, and move another drum into position. The thing is, no one wants to switch out the drum. So this doesn't get done until the contents have reached the brim. In the winter, the surface of the, shall we say, excreted material is not flat. No, at the low temperatures prevailing here, the excreted material freezes very quickly upon excretion. A cone-shaped formation builds up. I have heard it referred to as a poopsicle. The upward pointing end of the poopsicle presents a hazard, and it can reach the level of the seat. Are you following this? When I entered the outhouse that afternoon, I noticed immediately that the tip of the poopsicle was dangerously close to protruding. Too tired to replace the drum, I took great care in relieving myself. So did the rest of us. And later on, we did switch out the drum. On the morning of our fourth and last day, we made our way over to the pass between Mount Niles and Mount Daly. From there, we could look southward down a very inviting ski run of 15 kilometers to the Trans-Canada Highway at Wapta Lake. That would be the end of our trip. First, though, we had to contend with the most dangerous part. It's this steep and rather narrow canyon swept by avalanches from both sides. The sun had already been on the slopes for an hour. Snowballs were actively rolling down, a bad sign. Chris and I fingered our electronic avalanche beacons, making sure that they were working. But Mike didn't hesitate. He pushed off and ran the gauntlet without incident. Seeing him safely reach the flats beyond, Chris and I skied it too. "That was brave of you," I said to Mike as we joined him. "What?" he replied. "To run that thing first. Test the slope for Chris and me." Test the slope? I just wanted first crack at the powder. Farther below, we crossed a lot of fresh avalanche debris. Must have come down the day before. Good. The slope above was no longer a danger to us that afternoon. We reached Shorebrook Lake and slogged across in soft snow at the far end, where we found the tracks of day skiers who had come up the trail to the lake from the highway. 8 kilometers to go, all of it following a narrow path through the forest, and not much daylight left. We had to ski some of that in the dark, but we had headlamps, and through the trees we could see the lights of cars moving along the Trans-Canada Highway west of Lake Louise. The trail ended at Wapta Lodge. The bar was open. We had left a vehicle in the parking lot 4 days earlier. My car, which meant that I had to drive us back to Bow Lake. Everyone else knocked back the beer while I enjoyed my fruit juice. but you can tell from my smile that it tasted great. I have one more place to take you this evening. We started with springtime in the Rockies, and we will end there. This is the Easter long weekend in northern Banff National Park. Despite the date, the snow lies deep. The only bunnies hopping about are snowshoe hares. But there are people here. Tents are being set up. A helicopter is coming and going. You can't just be dropped off by helicopter anywhere in Banff National Park. Such trips have to be approved by the park superintendent, and that hardly ever happens. Something special is going on here. As you can see, this is a very official-looking group. Not. But they are from all over the world, and every one of them has a PhD. They are scientists. And I won't keep it from you any longer. They are here to explore this cave. Gadd Cave. That's Castle Gadd with a D on the end, not to be confused with Castle Gar, no D, British Columbia. Gadd Cave is Canada's longest, with 20 kilometers of known passages. The entrance is located near the south end of the Columbia Icefield in Gadd Meadows. Remember that picture of Gadd Meadows I showed you at the start of the show, when I told you that this talk would take you beneath the meadows? Well, now is the time. Gadd Cave is not only the longest in the country, it's also a dangerous one to enter in the wrong season. The sign says, "Beyond this point, cave passages are liable to complete and sudden flooding in the summer." This is why cavers go to Gadd in the winter. Some of the people in the first organized expedition, which was in 1967, had to wait several hours before the water receded enough to let them exit the cave. After they got out, the water level rose again, blocking the exit for many days. Close call. The sign continues, "Water rises rapidly up this pit and flows out of the entrance of the cave without warning. Flooding may occur in either sunny or stormy weather. There are no rescue personnel with knowledge of the cave, and no other entrances. Entry is illegal. Signed, Superintendent, Banff National Park." At the bottom of the sign, some wag has added, "Not only that, it's cold." Indeed, Gadd Cave is cold, and it's cold year-round. Once you get a half-kilometer back into the cave, the temperature is a steady 2.4 degrees Celsius, barely above freezing. That's whether it's winter or summer. Just for comparison, the air temperature in much of Mammoth Cave, Kentucky, is 12 degrees C year-round. The flooding and the temperature notwithstanding, here's the real reason so little exploration of Gadd Cave was done until the 1960s. About 150 meters in, you get to this 8-meter drop. Surprise! You have to break out the rope. I found that out when I was able to join an expedition into the cave in April of 1982. These photos and most of the others you're going to see are ones I took on that trip. Having rappelled down the first drop, you crawl on ice for about 350 meters. Even though the temperature in most of the cave is above freezing, it draws in air from outside all winter, so any water in the opening half-kilometer freezes solid. By the way, that's not me in the photo. It's Rick Cornelius, a park warden who came along with us for the first day of the trip. I could never grow a mustache as luxurious as his. Now, recall that the temperature of the cave is above freezing beyond a half-kilometer in. So instead of crawling along on Now, recall that the temperature of the cave is above freezing beyond a half-kilometer in. So instead of crawling along on solid ice, you have to wade. You have to wade in water with a temperature of 2.4 degrees, which is really cold. It's so cold that wading barefoot is excruciating. Plus, you can cut your feet on the rocks. So most of the cavers keep their leather boots on. Thus, their boots get soaked on the first day of the trip and remain wet for the duration. Stuff doesn't dry out underground. The humidity in Catamount Cave. Oh, sorry. Do that line again. I've been to Catamount Cave so much I automatically say it. Stuff doesn't dry out underground. The humidity in Canadian caves is 100%. Some cavers bring wetsuit slippers to wear through this passage instead of their boots, which they tie together and hang around their necks. That's what I did. And to answer an obvious question suggested by this photo, yes, guys, the water does get deep enough. Farther on, there is no more water in the passage. But then we come to another difficulty. It's a vertical pit, 24 meters deep, and we have to go down it. The easiest way to descend something like this is to slide down the rope, as we did near the entrance. Not a problem for an experienced caver. But then, how do we get back up? As you can see, there's a ladder. It's made of wire with aluminum rungs. Cavers carry such ladders with them, rolled up and deployed as needed. We used caving ladders on this pit and the one right at the start. And by the way, this photo is one I did not take. It's from an excellent film about the cave that was made jointly by Parks Canada and the National Film Board of Canada in 1973. It's called Castleguard Cave, Challenge Under the Glacier. And you can watch it on YouTube. The passage continuing from that wide-open pit has this narrow spot. We are carrying everything we need for The passage continuing from that wide-open pit has this narrow spot. We are carrying everything we need for 3 days underground, and here we have to take our packs off and push them through ahead of us. It's what cavers call a squeeze. Creatively, this one has been named The Squeeze. It's sort of like naming the big rock near Okotoks, Alberta, the Big Rock. It's worth getting through the squeeze because the passage immediately beyond opens up and runs very straight for nearly half a kilometer. I think you would agree with me that the name of this passage is perfect. It's called the Subway. There's nothing else quite like it in the Canadian Rockies. Past the subway, though, Castleguard Cave gets serious. The passage narrows upward and downward from the middle. There's no real ceiling or floor. You work your way along the walls. After 2 kilometers of that, we were quite tired. And fortuitously, there it was, Camp 1, a more or less flat spot big enough for a dozen people to lay out their sleeping bags. They lay out their sleeping bags on a cold, muddy surface, but we each had come prepared for that, with an impermeable foam pad between us and the ground. These pads kept our bags dry, well as dry as possible in that very high humidity, and they provided some additional warmth, too. Here is a caver at Camp 1 in his sleeping bag. The impermeable foam pad is too short, but he has extended it with a plastic garbage bag. However, he has no additional warmth from the knees down. Note the wet boots, which will not dry out overnight. His wet feet have dampened the end of the sleeping bag. Note also that water at 2.4 degrees C, is dripping onto his head. Why would anyone put up with this? All I can tell you is that he's British, and the British love to suffer. But hey, he's got a hot cup of tea. The next morning, my 2 friends, John Chaychuk on the left and Randy Spall on the right, are going to join me on a round trip of about 10 kilometers underground to the end of the cave and back to Camp 1. Well, it used to be thought of as the end of the cave. More has since been explored, but this will be enough for us. It's going to be a tough trip, and right away things get scary. No rope is in place to hang on to and make this section safer. It's called Holes in the Floor. Pretty good name, eh? And the floor itself is none too strong in some places in this cave. Further, the ceiling has its own hazards. We don't want to get one of those stalactites in the ear, nor do we wish to break any of them. Job 1 is to ensure our own safety, but job 2 is to protect the features of the cave. Incidentally, if a stalactite grows downward from the ceiling, what do you call a cave decoration that grows upward from the floor? That's right, a stalagmite. And here's the way a female caver once told me that she remembers which is which. When the mites go up, the tights come down. Some of the cave stalactites are quite fragile. See the little flags on the ends of these? They point toward the entrance. This must have something to do with the flow of air, which is from the right in the winter and from the left in the summer. Those columns of calcium carbonate between John and Randy are known as the fish. We learned the name later on. At the time, we were calling them the petrified cavers. And on the cave goes, much of it like this. Some sections are quite lovely, such as this one, a passage called the Grottos. But at this point, all I was thinking was, man, I hope we get to the end soon, because we are going to have to retrace our steps to get back to Camp 1, and we are already tired. Soon after that, I realized that we were, in fact, quite close to the end. We came to a well-known landmark in the cave. It's a 20-meter pit, and you have to climb up it. There is a rope in place for this, and we used Jumar ascenders to climb it safely. But imagine what it felt like for the first person to encounter this. His name was Mike Boone. He was a British-Canadian caver who spent a week exploring Castleguard Cave in November of 1970. He was alone. Mike had been a member of an official expedition 2 years earlier. Owing to a personality clash with leader Derek Ford, Mike Boone was not invited to take part in further exploration. Ford's group had not reached the end of the cave, so Mike decided to come back on his own. He told no one where he was going. Mike had brought rope, pitons, and a hammer with him, just in case he needed them. And boy, did he need them here. Fortunately, none of the pitons pulled out under Mike's weight as he hung on them. A fall near the top would have resulted in serious injury, with no hope of rescue. Are you wondering whether Mike Boone was crazy? The answer is yes. At one point, he was hospitalized for paranoid schizophrenia. But he was also one of the world's great cavers. He died in 2014. And no, it wasn't in a cave. Mike did reach the end of Castleguard. He made it back out alive and returned to tell others what he had found there. But no one believed him. What he found was glacial ice. Castleguard Cave runs way out into the Columbia icefield. Rocks embedded in the ice grind away at the rock underneath. The glacier has cut its way down far enough to intersect this passage in the cave, which means that Randy, on the right there, is looking at the belly of the Columbia icefield. The spot is called the Ice Plug. No other cave in the world is known to end like this one does. No other cave in the world is known to end like this one does. It's a unique place, and we have worked hard to get there. So I set my camera on a rock and once again asked that well-known photographer, Self-Timer, to get a picture of us at the ice plug. As the flash went off, I thought, Ben, you're a lucky guy. You have stood on the roof of the Canadian Rockies at Mount Robson, and you have reached the basement of the Canadian Rockies at Castleguard Cave. And you know, I'm still at it. Here's a photo of me with Will, my elder son, the same person who skied the backcountry trails with me when he was 8. The date is September 18th, 2023. He's 56. I'm 77. We're on the summit of a peak that overlooks our homes in Canmore. He's a mountain guide. I'm an old man, and a happy one. Many thanks to Parks Canada for some of the slides you saw this evening. Thanks to all of you for coming to my talk, and good night.